Today I want to talk to you about the religious side of the Renaissance, a time period we call the Reformation. What does it mean to reform something? Well, it means to change it, to improve it. But what if you were already happy with what you had before? The Reformation may become a revolution. What are the key concepts of the Protestant Reformation? This is a time period when there was an end to religious unity. Remember, in the Middle Ages, we called all of Europe Christendom because the one great Christian church, the Catholic Church, dominated all of Europe. But that's starting to break down in this time. We start to get attacks on the medieval church. We start looking at the doctrine, particularly the doctrine of infallibility of the Pope, and people start questioning it. We start questioning practices like the selling of indulgences. And we start wondering whether there couldn't be a better way to do things. These people that questioned the Catholic Church were protesting the Church. Thus, the Catholics began calling them Protestants or Protestant. So what exactly were the Protestants protesting against? The Catholic Church was the dominant social piece of architecture in all of Europe. The Catholic Church had most of the power and most of the money in Europe. Even kings were finding themselves questioning whether they were superior to the church or the church was superior to them. Who had the ultimate power? The Pope or the king? The Catholic Church was plagued by accusations of corruption from top to bottom. The Catholic Church seemed to have lost its moral compass, at least to a lot of Christians. It even extended to the popes. The most famous of these corrupt popes was a guy named Rodrigo Borgia. Rodrigo Borgia was busy lining his own pockets at the expense of his parishioners. Christians around the kingdom were starving to death, while the Pope was living like a king. Another big complaint that a lot of Christians had throughout Europe in this time period was the fact that they were handing out bishoprics as rewards for wealthy patrons rather than for pious living. The result was a lot of places had bishops that didn't live in the place they were supposed to be taking care of. Absenteeism of church leaders made the church seem even more out of touch with the people. And if you don't know your bishop, it's easier to protest against them. The straw that broke the camel's back with most people was the sale of indulgences. You see, the Pope had invented a veritable get-out-of-jail-free card. We'll call it a get-out-of-hell-free card. You could go buy an indulgence from the church, and the church would forgive you for all of your sins. You could buy time out of purgatory and buy your way into heaven. This meant the wealthy could live how they wanted to. They could do what they want to, live lives of debauchery, and then pay a tax to St. Peter. And they got to go to heaven, while the poor suffered in purgatory. To make matters even worse, if you had that uncle that you just weren't so sure about, you know, we all have that uncle. You could buy an indulgence for that person who had died years ago. You could buy their way out of purgatory and into heaven. This seemed wrong to many people. If there is a founding father of the Reformation, it's a German monk named Martin Luther. Martin Luther was one of those guys that we all know. He was always the best in his class. Martin Luther had grown up in a devout Catholic family. He'd gone off to college to study law, with every intention of becoming a wealthy lawyer, what his father wanted more than anything. And he was number one in his class. He was very good at law school. But he was coming home from law school and got caught in a terrible storm, walking down this road. I want you to imagine this storm with buckets of rain coming down, thunder clapping everywhere, lightning strikes hitting trees, water rolling down the roads up above his ankles. We know all this from Martin Luther's own writings. Martin Luther tells us he was caught in this storm and he knew God was angry, because that's the only explanation anyone has for thunderstorms, for lightning, is God's anger. A lightning bolt strikes a tree, the tree falls, almost hitting Martin Luther, and Martin Luther did the only thing he knew how to do, the thing he'd been taught to do his whole life. Martin Luther dropped down on his knees right there in that rushing water and screamed out to his family's patron saint, Saint Anne. He screamed out, "Saint Anne, if you'll only save me, I'll dedicate my life to God." And the rain stopped. Now I want you to think about that for a minute. The rain stopped when he made this prayer. And that prayer was, "If you save me, I'll dedicate my life to God." Martin Luther was nothing if he wasn't a man of his word. So he goes home and he tells his dad, "I'm dropping out of law school. I'm going to become a monk and live a life of poverty." You can imagine his father was not pleased. But just as he'd done in law school, at the monastery, he was number one in his class. He mastered everything. But he still had some questions. How do I know if I'm saved? This is a question we'll all struggle with at some point in our life. If you haven't struggled with the question, am I saved yet, you will struggle with it. Martin Luther goes to his abbot, the leader of the monastery, and he says, "How do I know I'm saved?" And the abbot says, "Read your Bible." It's pretty good advice. Martin Luther probably took it a little serious. He locked himself up in his cell, this little 8x8 room that the monks lived in. Had nothing to distract him, and he poured through the book from cover to cover, read the whole Bible in just a few days. This is something most people didn't do. Bibles weren't something you had at home. Remember, this is a time period, at least at the start, when books were being meticulously hand copied. But Martin Luther had gotten this Bible from the monastery and read the entire thing. And it left him with more questions than answers. He couldn't find some things in the Bible that the Catholic Church had been teaching. He didn't see anything about indulgences. He didn't really see anything about the Pope being the vicar of Christ. In fact, he had 95 issues with the church after this. Now remember, Martin Luther is a loyal Catholic monk. He's not trying to break the church, he's trying to fix the church. So he writes out these 95 theses. He goes to the cathedral in Wittenberg and he nails it on the door of the cathedral. Might have stopped there. Except about this same time, a guy named Johann Gutenberg had invented the printing press. And people needed more books, and Gutenberg needed more things to print, and he got a copy of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And he printed off copies by the hundreds. And within a fortnight, copies of Martin Luther's 95 Theses had spread throughout Christendom. And people were reading them. And they were saying, this monk has something. Maybe he's right. Maybe the Catholic Church is broken. The Catholic Church is not going to like this. In fact, the Catholic Church is going to think that this German monk is the problem. The Pope sends out a message to the Archbishop there in Luther's area, in Wittenberg, Germany. That wasn't called Germany yet, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And that Archbishop then sends a message. And that message is best translated as, "Bring me the head of that damned German monk." Luther is called up to speak before the Archbishop. Now remember, at this point, Luther is still a loyal Catholic. This is Luther at his most heroic to me. Martin Luther is ushered in, and he's told ahead of time, Martin Luther, you're going to be brought out before the Pope. The Pope is going to ask you if these are your words. You're going to say they're yours. He's then going to ask you if you still mean everything you said in the 95 Theses, and by this point, a few other tracts that he had written. And you're going to say one word. You're going to say the word recanto. I take it back. I recant. And if you simply do that, everything's forgiven. You get to go back to Wittenberg. We'll make you a professor. You can be the most popular professor on campus. Everything will be great. Luther agrees. He's brought up before the Archbishop. The Archbishop says, Martin Luther, are these your words? He says, they are mine. Martin Luther, do you still hold these words to be true? And Martin Luther says, can I think about it? This is not what the Archbishop wanted to hear. Martin Luther is thrown in a cell and he's given 24 hours. Martin Luther says in his own words that he wrestled with the devil all night long. I love the poetry of that. I wrestled with the devil all night long. Now, does that mean that demons were there and he was physically wrestling? No. It means he was wrestling with the question of, do I stay true to my beliefs of what the Bible says, or do I stay true to the beliefs of the Catholic Church that the Pope is infallible and I'm wrong? The next day he was dragged back out again, thrown up in front of the Archbishop. The Archbishop again asked him, Martin Luther, are these your words? He proudly says, they are mine. Martin Luther, do you still hold these words to be true? And Martin Luther threw his arms out as if he was Christ on the cross and said, here I stand. They are my words. I can do no more. I'll translate that to you. Yes, I said it. Yes, I mean it. Yes, I'm right. It might have died there. Martin Luther could have had a excommunication on him and a death penalty from the church for this. This is something that you could be put to death for. But there were a few princes in the Holy Roman Empire that supported Luther, and they had put some military men there in the crowd, and they grabbed Martin Luther and rushed him out and rushed him to a guy named Frederick the Elector's home. Frederick the Elector was a Holy Roman Empire prince. And Frederick protected Martin Luther. He was still excommunicated. This broke the Catholic Church. Martin Luther is no longer trying to be a loyal Catholic. He's trying to be a loyal Christian, a new kind of Christian, a Protestant Christian. And the new church that grows up is going to bear his name. It'll be the Lutheran Church. The fundamental principle of Protestantism, at least under Martin Luther, was the idea of Sola Scriptura, the Bible alone. It was this belief that each one of us can be our own priest. He called it the priesthood of all believers. And each of us could read the Bible for ourselves and interpret what it means. We didn't need a pope or a bishop or a priest to act as a middleman between us and God. You didn't have to have the Bible interpreted. It was written clearly to you. This was a strike at the heart of Catholicism. If you don't need the Pope to make interpretations, why do you have a Pope? In Switzerland, there emerged another Protestant reformer. His name was Heydrich Swingley. Heydrich Swingley was at first a follower of Luther, but by the end he was much more radical than Luther ever had been. Luther stuck to most of the Catholic doctrines. Zwingli's going to throw most of them out. Heydrich Swingley is going to be an iconoclast. He wants to break down icons. He wants to break down all of the vestiges of Catholicism. The followers of Zwingli will even whitewash the churches and break the stained glass windows because they saw these as icons and intermediaries between man and God. Zwingli's going to question everything. He's going to oppose the concept of purgatory, saying, I can't find purgatory in the Bible. He's going to question clerical celibacy. In the Catholic Church, priests weren't allowed to marry, although a few popes had done it. Zwingli is going to say there's no crime in marriage. In fact, he argues that family is the heart of Christianity. This is a pretty radical idea in 1519. He's going to go against the idea of intercession of the saints, this concept in the Catholic belief that you could pray to a saint and that saint would intercede in your behalf to God. Exactly what Martin Luther had done with Saint Anne earlier. Zwingli's going to say that's supernatural nonsense. Zwingli's church is going to be much more mainstreamed, much more streamlined. It's also going to be much more radical and much more violent. It's going to usher in the revolutions we talked about before. The Zwingliites are going to rush into churches breaking stuff. It's going to be violence under Heydrich Swingley. Another contemporary Protestant was a Frenchman named John Calvin who had moved to Geneva, Switzerland. John Calvin is also going to start his life as a follower of Martin Luther. But like Zwingli, he's going to take this to an extreme. John Calvin is going to come up with the idea of the doctrine of the elect. Sometimes we call this the doctrine of predestination. He's going to believe that God already knows who's going to be saved before you were ever born, and that works on this earth cannot save you. How does he come about this belief? John Calvin is going to look at this basic question. He's going to ask the question, do you believe that God is omniscient? That means all-knowing. Well, that's a pretty basic Christian belief. Everybody believes God is all-knowing. Then he asks, do you believe that God is omnipotent, all-powerful? That is also a pretty basic belief in Christianity. And finally, he says, do you believe that God is omnipresent? That means always present, always there. A third, very simple, very fundamental belief of Christianity. Well, John Calvin then said, if you believe in a God that is always there watching, that is all-knowing and all-powerful, you have to believe in a God that already knows if you're going to sin, already knows if you're going to heaven, and has the power to stop it and put you either in heaven or hell if he wishes. So these people that were chosen by God, John Calvin calls them the elect. Now, this doesn't mean that you're free to go live a life of debauchery. John Calvin would say, if you're of the elect, you will lead your life correctly because God has preordained that. You will live a Christian life. It's an interesting belief. It's sometimes a scary belief because if you take Calvinism and predestination to its nth degree, you can get hedonism. You can get people saying, if my works don't matter, why should I be good? If my works don't matter, I might as well have a good time while I'm here. And while that wasn't John Calvin's intention, it was what some people did. In England, the Reformation took a totally different path. The Reformation is going to be ushered in by King Henry VIII. Now, I'll talk to you about Henry VIII. Henry was never supposed to be king. Henry was the second son. His older brother was supposed to be king. And his older brother had been raised to be a king, while Henry had been raised to be kind of a party boy. He was like a frat boy loose on the city. They used to call him Prince Hal, and he was known for chasing women and drinking too much. His brother, however, had been trained in the arts of kingship. They'd even found him the perfect wife. His brother had married a lady named Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was related to both the King and Queen of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. This was the perfect bride. The problem is, he dies before he becomes king, and that raises Prince Hal up to Henry VIII. Now Henry VIII needs that perfect wife. The problem is she's already been married. It's Catherine, his brother's widow. And the Bible has some pretty clear restrictions on marrying your brother's widow. So what do? Well, Henry VIII is a loyal follower of Catholicism. In fact, he'd written some very eloquent tracts against Martin Luther earlier. so much so that the king or the Pope had given Henry VIII the title of Defender of the Faith, a title that every monarch of England has held since then. But Henry really needs to marry Catherine to justify his place, to centralize his power in Europe. So what do? Well, you ask the Pope for permission, because remember, the Pope can give dispensations in the Catholic faith. So he writes a letter to the Pope, and he explains his political situation, asks to marry Catherine of Aragon. The Pope at first refuses it. But then Henry comes up with a genius idea. He manages to convince the Pope that Catherine was never really married to his brother, her first husband. How do you go about doing that? Well, under biblical law, a marriage is not complete until it's been consummated. It's not complete until you have sex. And Catherine swears an affidavit that she never consummated her first marriage. So Henry's argument is the marriage was never consummated, therefore I can marry her. Eventually he gets a dispensation. The Pope allows Henry to marry Catherine, and everything looks great. Catherine gets pregnant very quickly. Henry is all set to introduce the world to his new son, and a daughter is born, Princess Mary. Catherine of Aragon then has a series of stillbirths, and Henry is now convinced that his wife and the sin of the marriage is what is preventing him from getting a male heir. Now, no female has ever led England at this point. To protect your family's dynasty, you have to have a male heir. So Henry asks the Pope for a divorce. This creates a whole new problem, because now if the Pope grants Henry VIII a divorce, he's basically admitting that he was wrong to give the dispensation in the first place. You're questioning the Pope's doctrine of infallibility. The Pope still might have done that, still might have granted Henry VIII permission to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. But enter the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor is the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, and he doesn't want his family to be embarrassed by this divorce. The Holy Roman Emperor is also the person with an army in Rome to defend it. And he goes to the Pope and he tells the Pope, if you grant this dispensation, my army won't defend Rome. My army will sack Rome. So the Pope refuses Henry VIII his divorce. What do you do now? So Henry asks his advisors, what do we do? I've got to divorce Catherine. The Pope won't allow me. What can I do? And the thought is raised. You have to ask the leader of the church for permission, right? And Henry says, yes, I've got to ask the leader of the church. Well, what if you were the leader of the church? So Henry VIII thinks on this for a minute and decides this will work. So he breaks England with the Catholic Church and he forms this brand new Anglican church, the Church of England. And the leader of the Church of England is the King of England. So now, conveniently, Henry has to ask himself for permission to divorce Catherine. He granted it, divorced Catherine, goes on and marries. He does have another daughter. He has Elizabeth, and eventually he does have a son, Edward. But the church is broken. And Henry VIII is not going to continue to be a good example to Christians. Henry VIII had another issue. He collected brides. He divorced his first wife. He beheaded his second wife for adultery. His third wife died mysteriously, divorced his fourth, beheaded his fifth again for adultery, and his sixth wife finally survived him. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. And you have a new church, the Church of England, a Protestant church.